More William Part 2. When William first saw him, he was leaning against the wall of the White Lion, gazing at the passers-by with a moody smile upon his villainous-looking countenance. It was evident to any careful observer that he had not confined his attentions to the exterior of the White Lion. William, at whose heels trotted his beloved mongrel, rightly named Jumble, was passing him with a casual glance when something attracted his attention. He stopped and looked back, then, turning round, stood in front of the tall, untidy figure, gazing up at him with frank curiosity. "Who cut them off?" he said at last in an odd whisper. The figure raised his hands and stroked the long hair down the side of his face. "Now you are asking," he said with a grin. "Well, who did?" persisted William. "That would be telling," answered his new friend, moving unsteadily from one foot to the other. "See, you got them cut off in the war," said William firmly. "I didn't. I've been in the war, all right. Strike me pink, I've been in the war, and that's the truth. But I didn't get them cut off in the war. Well, I'll stop kidding you. I'll tell you straight. I never had none. No." William stood on tiptoe to peer under the untidy hair at the small apertures that in his strange new friend took the place of ears. Admiration shone in William's eyes. "Was you born without them?" he said enviously. His friend nodded. "No, don't you go talking about it," he went on modestly, though seeming to bask in the sun of William's evident awe and respect. "I don't want all folks knowing about it. See? It kind of marks a man, this here sort of thing. See? Makes him too easy to track, like. That's why I grow me hair long. See? Here, have a drink." He put his head inside the window of the White Lion and roared out, "Bottle of lemonade for the young gent." William followed him to a small table in the little sunny porch, and his heart swelled with pride as he sat and drank his beverage with a manly air. His friend, who said his name was Mr. Blank, showed a most flattering interest in him. He elicited from him the whereabouts of his house and the number of his family, a description of the door and window fastenings, of the dining room silver and his mother's jewelry. William, his eyes fixed with a fascinated stare upon Mr. Blank's ears, gave the required information readily, glad to be able in any way to interest this intriguing and mysterious being. "Tell me about the war," said William at last. "It were all right while it lasted," said Mr. Blank with a sigh. "It were all right, but I suppose, like most things in this here world, it couldn't last forever. See." William set down the empty glass of lemonade and leant across the table, almost dizzy with the romance of the moment. Had Douglas, had Henry, had Ginger, had any of those boys who sat next him at school and joined in the feeble relaxations provided by the authorities out of school, ever done this, ever sat at a real table outside a real public house drinking lemonade and talking to a man with no ears who'd fought in the war and who looked as if he might have done anything? Jumble, meanwhile, sat and snapped at flies, frankly bored. "Did you," said William in a whisper, "did you ever kill anyone?" Mr. Blank laughed a laugh that made William's blood go cold. "Me kill anyone? Me kill anyone? Hundreds." William breathed a sigh of satisfaction. Here was romance and adventure indeed. "What do you do now the war's over?" Mr. Blank closed one eye. "That would be telling, wouldn't it?" I'll keep it awfully secret, pleaded William. I'll never tell anyone. Mr. Blank shook his head. What you want to know for, anyway? He said. William answered eagerly, his eyes alight. 'Cause I'd like to do just the same when I grow up. Mr. Blank flung back his head and emitted laugh after laugh of unaffected mirth. Oh, hell, he said, wiping his eyes. Oh, strike me pink. That's good, that is. You wait, young gent. You wait till you've grown up and see what you possess to it. Oh, hell. He rose and pulled his cap down over his eyes. Well, I'll say good day to you, young gent. William looked at him wistfully. I'd like to see you again, Mr. Blank. I would, honest. Will you be here this afternoon? What'd you want to see me again for? Said Mr. Blank suspiciously. I like you, said William fervently. I like the way you talk, and I like the things you say, and I want to know about what you do. Mr. Blank was obviously flattered. I may be round here again this afternoon, though I make no promise. See? I've got to be careful, I have. I've got to be careful who sees me and who hears me and where I go. That's the worst of having no ears. See? William did not see, but he was thrilled to the soul by the mystery. And you don't tell no one you've seen me nor nothing about me, went on Mr. Blank. Pulling his cap still farther over his head, Mr. Blank set off unsteadily down the road, leaving William to pay for his lemonade with his last penny. He walked home, his heart set firmly on a lawless career of crime. Opposition he expected from his father and mother and Robert and Ethel, but his determination was fixed. He wondered if it would be very painful to have his ears cut off. He entered the dining room with an air of intense mystery, pulling his cap over his eyes and looking round in a threatening manner. William, what do you mean by coming into the house in your cap? Take it off at once. William sighed. He wondered if Mr. Blank had a mother. When he returned, he sat down and began quietly to remodel his life. He would not be an explorer, after all, nor an engine, driver, nor chimney sweep. He would be a man of mystery, a murderer, fighter, forger. He fingered his ears tentatively. They seemed fixed on jolly fast. He glanced with utter contempt at his father, who had just come in. His father's life of blameless respectability seemed to him, at that minute, utterly despicable. The Wilkinsons over at Todfoot have had their house broken into now, Mrs. Brown was saying. All her jewelry gone. They think it's a gang. It's just the villages round here. There seems to be one every day. William expressed his surprise. Oh, hell, he ejaculated with a slightly self-conscious air. Mr. Brown turned round and looked at his son. May I ask, he said politely, where you picked up that expression? I got it off one of my friends, said William with quiet pride. Then I'd take it as a personal favor, went on Mr. Brown, if you'd kindly refrain from airing your friends' vocabularies in this house. He means you're never to say it again, William, translated Mrs. Brown sternly. Never. All right, said William. I won't. See? Ida, jolly well won't. Strike me pink. See. He departed with an air of scowling mystery and dignity combined, leaving his parents speechless with amazement. That afternoon he returned to the White Lion. Mr. Blank was standing unobtrusively in the shadow of the wall. "Hello, young gent," he greeted William. "Nice dog you've got." William looked proudly down at Jumble. "You won't find," he said proudly and with some truth, "you won't find another dog like this. Not for miles." "Will he be much good as a watchdog now?" asked Mr. Blank carelessly. "Good," said William, almost indignant at the question. "There isn't any sort of dog he isn't good at." Said Mr. Blank, looking at him thoughtfully. "Tell me about things you've done," said William earnestly. "Yes, I will, too," said Mr. Blank. "But just you tell me first who lives at all these here nice houses and all about them." "See?" William readily complied, and the strange couple gradually made their way along the road towards William's house. William stopped at the gate and considered deeply. He was torn between instincts of hospitality and a dim suspicion that his family would not afford to Mr. Blank that courtesy which is a guest's due. He looked at Mr. Blank's old green, black cap, long, untidy hair, dirty, lined, sly old face, muddy clothes and gaping boots, and decided quite finally that his mother would not allow him in her drawing room. "Will you," he said tentatively, "will you come round and see our back garden? If we go behind these old bushes and keep close along the wall, no one'll see us." To William's relief, Mr. Blank did not seem to resent the suggestion of secrecy. They crept along the wall in silence except for Jumble, who loudly worried Mr. Blank's trailing boot strings as he walked. They reached a part of the back garden that was not visible from the house and sat down together under a shady tree. "Perhaps," began Mr. Blank politely, "you could bring a bit o' tea out to me on the quiet like." "I'll ask Mother," began William. "Oh, no," said Mr. Blank modestly. "I don't want to give no one no trouble. Just a slice o' bread, if you can find it, without troubling no one." See? William had a brilliant idea. "Let's go across to that window and get in," he said eagerly. "That's the library and no one uses it except Father, and he's not until later." Mr. Blank insisted on tying Jumble up, then he swung himself quickly through the window. William gave a gasp of admiration. "You did that fine," he said. Again Mr. Blank closed one eye. "Not the first time I've got in at a window, young gent, nor the last, I bet. Not by a long way." "See?" William followed more slowly. His eye gleamed with pride. This hero of romance and adventure was now his guest under his roof. "Make yourself quite at home, Mr. Blank," he said with an air of intense politeness. Mr. Blank did. He emptied Mr. Brown's cigar box into his pocket. He drank 3 glasses of Mr. Brown's whiskey and soda. While William's back was turned, he filled his pockets with the silver ornaments from the mantel piece. He began to inspect the drawers in Mr. Brown's desk. Then, "William, come to tea." "You stay here," whispered William. "I'll bring you some." But luck was against him. It was a visitor's tea in the drawing room, and Mrs. de Vere Carter, a neighbor, there in all her glory. She rose from her seat with an ecstatic murmur. "Willie, dear child, sweet little soul." With one arm, she crushed the infuriated William against her belt. With the other, she caressed his hair. Then William, in moody silence, sat down in a corner and began to eat bread and butter. Every time he prepared to slip a piece into his pocket, He found his mother's or Mrs. de Vere Carter's eye fixed upon him and hastily began to eat it himself. He sat, miserable and hot, seeing only the heroic figure starving in the next room, and planned a raid on the larder as soon as he could reasonably depart. Every now and then he scowled across at Mrs. de Vere Carter and made a movement with his hands, as though pulling a cap over his eyes. He invested even his eating with an air of dark mystery. Then Robert, his elder brother, came in, followed by a thin, pale man with eye-glasses and long hair. "This is Mr. Lewis, mother," said Robert with an air of pride and triumph. "He's editor of Fiddle Strings." There was an immediate stir and sensation. Robert had often talked of his famous friend. In fact, Robert's family was weary of the sound of his name, but this was the first time Robert had induced him to leave the haunts of his genius to visit the Brown household. Mr. Lewis bowed with a set, stern, self-conscious expression, as though to convey to all that his celebrity was more of a weight than a pleasure to him. Mrs. de Vere Carter bridled and fluttered, for Fiddle Strings had a society column and a page of news of the town, and Mrs. de Vere Carter's greatest ambition was to see her name in print. Mr. Lewis sat back in his chair, took his tea cup as though it were a fresh addition to his responsibilities, and began to talk. He talked apparently without even breathing. He began on the weather, drifted on to art and music, and was just beginning a monologue on the novel, when William rose and crept from the room like a guilty spirit. He found Mr. Blank under the library table, having heard a noise in the kitchen and fearing a visitor. A cigar and a silver snuffer had fallen from his pocket to the floor. He hastily replaced them. William went up and took another look at the wonderful ears, and heaved a sigh of relief. While parted from his strange friend, he had had a horrible suspicion that the whole thing was a dream. "I'll go to the larder and get you something," he said. "You just stay here." "I think, young gent," said Mr. Blank, "I think I'll just go and look round upstairs on the quiet like, and you needn't mention it to no one." "See." Again, he performed the fascinating wink. They crept on tiptoe into the hall, but the drawing-room door was ajar. William's heart stood still. He could hear his mother coming across the room then. She stood in the doorway, her face filled with horror as her eye fell upon Mr. Blank. "William," she said. William's feelings were beyond description. Desperately, he sought for an explanation for his friend's presence. With what pride and coolness had Robert announced his uninvited guest. William determined to try it, at any rate. He advanced boldly into the drawing-room. "This is Mr. Blank, mother," he announced jauntily. "He hasn't got no ears." Mr. Blank stood in the background, awaiting developments. Flight was now impossible. The announcement fell flat. There was nothing but horror upon the 5 silent faces that confronted William. He made a last desperate effort. "He's been in the war," he pleaded. "He's killed folks." Then the unexpected happened. Mrs. de Vere Carter rose with a smile of welcome. In her mind's eye she saw the touching story already in print. The tattered hero, the gracious lady, the age of democracy. The stage was laid, and that dark, pale young man had only to watch and listen. "Ah, one of our dear heroes. My poor, brave man." A cup of tea, my dear, turning to William's thunderstruck mother. And he may sit down, may he not? She kept her face well turned towards the sardonic, looking Mr. Lewis. He must not miss a word or gesture. How proud we are to do anything for our dear heroes. Wounded, perhaps? Ah, poor man. She floated across to him with a cup of tea and plied him with bread and butter and cake. William sat down meekly on a chair, looking rather pale. Mr. Blank, whose philosophy was to take the goods the gods gave and not look to the future, began to make a hearty meal. "Are you looking for work, my poor man?" asked Mrs. de Vere Carter, leaning forward in her chair. Her poor man replied with simple, manly directness that he was damned if he was. See? Mr. Lewis began to discuss the drama with Robert. Mrs. de Vere Carter raised her voice. "How you must have suffered. Yes, there is suffering ingrained in your face. A piece of shrapnel? 10 inches square? Right in at one hip and out at the other? Oh, my poor man. How I feel for you. How all class distinctions vanish at such a time. How—" She stopped while Mr. Blank drank his tea. In fact, all conversation ceased while Mr. Blank drank his tea, just as conversation on a station ceases while a train passes through. Mrs. Brown looked helplessly around her. When Mr. Blank had eaten a plate of sandwiches, a plate of bread and butter, and half a cake, he rose slowly, keeping one hand over the pocket in which reposed the silver ornaments. "Well, ma'am," he said, touching his cap. "Thank you kindly. I've had a fine tea. I have. A damn fine tea. And I'll not forget you kindness to a poor old soldier." Here he winked brazenly at William. "And good day to you all." Mrs. de Vere Carter floated out to the front door with him, and William followed as in a dream. Mrs. Brown found her voice. "We'd better have the chair disinfected," she murmured to Ethel. Then Mrs. de Vere Carter returned smiling to herself and eyeing the young editor thoughtfully. "I witnessed a pretty scene the other day in a suburban drawing room. It might begin like that." William followed the amazing figure round the house again to the library window. Here turned to him with a friendly grin. "I'm just going to have that look round upstairs now. See," he said. "And once more, you don't need to say nothing to no one. See." With a familiar, beloved gesture, he drew his old cap down over his eyes and was gone. William wandered upstairs a few minutes later to find his visitor standing at the landing window, his pockets bulging. "I'm going to try this here window, young gent," he said in a quick, business-like voice. "I see Pa coming in at the front gate. Give me a shove. Quick, now." Mr. Brown entered the drawing room. "Mulroyd's had his house burgled now," he said. "Every bit of his wife's jewelry gone. They've got some clues, though. It's a gang all right, and one of them is a chap without ears. Grows his hair long to hide it. But it's a clue. The police are hunting for him." He looked in amazement at the horror-stricken faces before him. Mrs. Brown sat down weakly. "Ethel, my smelling salts. They're on the mantelpiece." Robert grew pale. "Good Lord, my silver cricket cup," he gasped, racing upstairs. The landing window had been too small and Mr. Blank too big, though William did his best. There came to the astounded listeners the sound of a fierce scuffle. Then Robert descended, his hair rumpled and his tie awry, holding William by the arm. William looked pale and apprehensive. "He was there," panted Robert, "just getting out of the window. He chucked the things out of his pockets and got away. I couldn't stop him. And William was there." William's face assumed the expression of one who is prepared for the worst. The brave little chap, struggling with him, trying to pull him back from the window, all by himself. "I wasn't," cried William excitedly. "I was helping him. He's my friend. But they heard not a word. They crowded round him, praised him, shook hands with him, asked if he was hurt. Mrs. de Vere Carter kept up one perpetual scream of delight and congratulation. The dear boy, the little pet, how brave, what courage, what an example to us all. And the horrid, wretched man, posing as a hero, getting himself into the sweet child's confidence. Are you hurt, my precious? Did the nasty man hurt you? You darling boy." When the noise had somewhat subsided, Mr. Brown came forward and laid a hand on William's shoulder. "I'm very pleased with you, my boy," he said. "You can buy anything you like tomorrow up to 5 shillings. William's bewildered countenance cleared. "Thank you, father," he said meekly. "A night," said Miss Drew, who was struggling to inspire her class with enthusiasm for Tennyson's Idylls of the King. "A knight was a person who spent his time going round succoring the oppressed." "Sucking what?" said William, bewildered. "Succor means to help. He spent his time helping anyone who was in trouble." "How much did he get for it?" asked William. "Nothing, of course," said Miss Drew, appalled by the base commercialism of the 20th century. "He helped the poor because he loved them, William. He had a lot of adventures and fighting, and he helped beautiful, persecuted girls." William's respect for the knight rose. "Of course," said Miss Drew hastily, "they needn't necessarily be beautiful, but in most of the stories we have, they were beautiful." Followed some stories of fighting and adventure and the rescuing of beautiful girls. The idea of the thing began to take hold of William's imagination. "I say," he said to his chum Ginger after school, "that knight thing sounds all right. Sucking, I mean helping people and fighting and all that. I wouldn't mind doing it, and you could be my squire." "Yes," said Ginger slowly. "I'd thought of doing it, but I'd thought of you being the squire." "Well," said William after a pause, "let's be squires in turn. You first," he added hastily. "What'll you give me if I'm first?" said Ginger, displaying again the base commercialism of his age. William considered. "I'll give you first drink out of a bottle of ginger ale, what I'm going to get with my next money. It'll be 3 weeks off, 'cause they're taking the next 2 weeks to pay for an old window what my balls slipped into by mistake." He spoke with the bitterness that always characterized his statements of the injustice of the grown-up world. "All right," said Ginger. "I won't forget about the drink of ginger ale." "No, you won't," said Ginger simply. "I'll remind you all right. Well, let's set off." "Course," said William. "It would be nicer with armor and horses and trumpets, but I expect folks would think anyone a bit soft what went about in the streets in armor now, 'cause these times is different."
She said so.
Anyway, she said we could still be knights and help people, didn't she? Anyway, I'll get my bugle. That'll be something. William's bugle had just returned to public life after one of its periodic terms of retirement into his father's keeping. William took his bugle proudly in one hand and his pistol, the glorious result of a dip in the bran tub at a school party, in the other, and, sternly denying themselves the pleasures of afternoon school, off the two set upon the road of romance and adventure. "I'll carry the bugle," said Ginger, "'cause I'm squire." William was unwilling to give up his treasure. "Well, I'll carry it now," he said, "but when I begin fighting folks, I'll give it you to hold." They walked along for about a mile, without meeting anyone. William began to be aware of a sinking feeling in the region of his waist. "I wonder what they eat," he said at last. "I'm getting so's I wouldn't mind something to eat." "We did not have set off before dinner," said the squire with the event wisdom. "We ought to have waited till after dinner." "You ought to have brought something," said William severely. "You're the squire. You're not much of a squire not to have brought something for me to eat." "And me," put in Ginger. "If I'd brought any, I'd have brought it for me more'n for you." William fingered his minute pistol. "If we meet any wild animals," he said darkly. A cow gazed at them mournfully over a hedge. "You might go and milk that," suggested William. "Milk would be better than nothing." "You go and milk it." "No, I'm not squire." "I bet squires did the milking. Knights wouldn't have done the milking." "I'll remember," said Ginger bitterly, "when you're squire, all the things what you said a squire ought to do when I was squire." They entered the field and gazed at the cow from a respectful distance. She turned her eyes upon them sadly. "Go on," said the knight to his reluctant squire. "I'm not good at cows," objected that gentleman. "Well, I will, then," said William with reckless bravado, and advanced boldly upon the animal. The animal very slightly lowered its horns, perhaps in sign of greeting, and emitted a deep "mo." "Oh, oh, oh," like lightning the gallant pair made for the road. "Anyway," said William gloomily, "we got nothing to put it in, so we'd only have got tossed for nothing, perhaps, if we'd gone on." They walked on down the road till they came to a pair of iron gates and a drive that led up to a big house. William's spirits rose. His hunger was forgotten. "Come on," he said. "We might find someone to rescue here. It looks like a place where there might be someone to rescue." There was no one in the garden to question the right of entry of two small boys armed with a bugle and a toy pistol. Unchallenged, they went up to the house. While the knight was wondering whether to blow his bugle at the front door or by the open window, they caught sight suddenly of a vision inside the window. It was a girl as fair and slim and beautiful as any wandering knight could desire, and she was speaking fast and passionately. William, ready for all contingencies, marshaled his forces. "Follow me," he whispered, and crept on all fours nearer the window. They could see a man now, an elderly man with white hair and a white beard. "And how long will you keep me in this vile prison?" she was saying in a voice that trembled with anger. "Base wretch that you are." "Crumbs!" ejaculated William. "Ha! Ha!" sneered the man. "I have you in my power. I will keep you here a prisoner till you sign the paper which will make me master of all your wealth and beware, girl, if you do not sign, you may answer for it with your life." "Wow," murmured William. Then he crawled away into the bushes, followed by his attendant squire. "Well," said William, his face purple with excitement, "we've found someone to rescue, all right. He's a base wretch," what she said, all right. "Will you kill him?" said the odd squire. "How big was he?" "Could you see?" said William the discreet. "He was ever so big. Great big face he had, too, with a beard." "Then I won't try killing him. Not straight off. I'll think of some plan, something cunning." He sat with his chin on his hands, gazing into space, till they were surprised by the opening of the front door and the appearance of a tall, thick-set, elderly man. William quivered with excitement. The man went along a path through the bushes. William and Ginger followed on all fours with elaborate caution. At every almost inaudible sound from Ginger, William turned his red, frowning face onto him with a resounding sh. The path ended at a small shed with a locked door. The man opened the door. The key stood in the lock, and entered. Promptly William, with a snarl expressive of cunning and triumph, hurled himself at the door and turned the key in the lock. Here came an angry shout from inside. "Who's that? What the devil?" "You low old devil," said William through the keyhole. "Who?" exploded the voice. "You base wretch, like what she said you was," bawled William, his mouth still applied closely to the keyhole. "Let me out at once, or I'll—" "You mean old oppressor? Who are you? What's this stupid trick? Let me out. Do you hear?" A resounding kick shook the door. "I've got a pistol," said William sternly. "I'll shoot you dead if you kick the door down, you dirty old beast." The sound of kicking ceased, and a scrambling and scraping, accompanied by oaths, proceeded from the interior. "I'll stay on guard," said William with the tense expression of the soldier at his post, "and you go and set her free. Go and blow the bugle at the front door, then they'll know something's happened," he added simply. Miss Priscilla Green was pouring out tea in the drawing room. 2 young men and a maiden were the recipients of her hospitality. "Dad will be here in a minute," she said. "He's just gone to the dark room to see to some photos he'd left in toning or fixing or something. We'll get on with the rehearsal as soon as he comes. We just rehearsed the scene he and I have together, so we're ready for the ones where we all come in." "How did it go off?" "Oh, quite well. We knew our parts, anyway. I think the village will enjoy it. Anyway, it's never very critical, is it? And it loves a melodrama." "Yes. I wonder if Father knows you're here. He said he'd come straight back. Perhaps I'd better go and find him." "Oh, let me go, Miss Green," said one of the youths ardently. "Well, I don't know whether you'd find the place. It's a shed in the garden that he uses. We use half as a dark room and half as a coal cellar. I'll go." He stopped. A nightmare sound, as discordant as it was ear-splitting, filled the room. Miss Green sank back into her chair, suddenly white. One of the young men let a cup of tea fall neatly from his fingers onto the floor and there crash into fragments. The young lady visitor emitted a scream that would have done credit to a factory siren. Then at the open French window appeared a small boy holding a bugle, purple, faced with the effort of his performance. One of the young men was the first to recover speech. He stepped away from the broken crockery on the floor as if to disclaim all responsibility for it and said sternly, "Did you make that horrible noise?" Miss Green began to laugh hysterically. "Do have some tea now you've come," she said to Ginger. Ginger remembered the pangs of hunger, of which excitement had momentarily rendered him oblivious, and, deciding that there was no time like the present, took a cake from the stand and began to consume it in silence. "You'd better be careful," said the young lady to her hostess. "He might have escaped from the asylum. He looks mad." He had a very mad look, I thought, when he was standing at the window. He's evidently hungry anyway. I cannot think why father doesn't come. Here Ginger, fortified by a walnut bun, remembered his mission. "It's all right now," he said. "You can go home." He shut up. Me and William shut him up. "You see," said the young lady with a meaning glance around. "I said he was from the asylum. He looked mad. We'd better humor him and ring up the asylum. Have another cake, darling boy," she said in a tone of honeyed sweetness. Very willing, Ginger selected an ornate pyramid of icing. At this point there came a bellowing and crashing and tramping outside, and Miss Priscilla's father, roaring fury and threats of vengeance, hurled himself into the room. Miss Priscilla's father had made his escape by a small window at the other end of the shed. To do this, he had had to climb over the coals in the dark. His face and hands and clothes and once white beard were covered with coal. His eyes gleamed whitely. A disgraceful attack, utterly unprovoked, cowardly rogues. Here he stopped to cough because his mouth was full of coal dust. While he was coughing, William, who had just discovered that his bird had flown, appeared at the window. "He's got out," he said reproachfully. "Look at him. He's got out. And all our trouble for nothing. Why didn't someone stop him getting out?" William and Ginger sat on the railing that separated their houses. "It's not really much fun being a knight," said William slowly. "No," agreed Ginger. "You never know when folks is oppressed. And anyway, what's one afternoon away from school to make such a fuss about?" "Seems to me from what father said," went on William gloomily, "you'll have to wait a jolly long time for that drink of ginger ale." An expression of dejection came over Ginger's face. "And you wasn't even ever squire," he said. Then he brightened. "They were jolly good cakes, wasn't they?" he said. William's lips curved into a smile of blissful reminiscence. "Jolly good," he agreed. Uncle George was William's godfather, and he was intensely interested in William's upbringing. It was an interest with which William would gladly have dispensed. Uncle George's annual visit was to William a purgatory only to be endured by a resolutely philosophic attitude of mind and the knowledge that sooner or later it must come to an end. Uncle George had an ideal of what a boy should be, and it was a continual grief to him that William fell so short of this ideal. But he never relinquished his efforts to make William conform to it. His ideal was a gentle boy of exquisite courtesy and of intellectual pursuits. Such a boy he could have loved. It was hard that fate had endowed him with a godson like William. William was neither quiet nor gentle, nor courteous nor intellectual, but William was intensely human. The length of Uncle George's visit this year was beginning to reach the limits of William's patience. He was beginning to feel that sooner or later something must happen. For 5 weeks now he had, reluctantly, accompanied Uncle George upon his morning walk. He had, generally unsuccessfully, tried to maintain that state of absolute quiet that Uncle George's afternoon rest required. He had in the evening listened wearily to Uncle George's stories of his youth. His usual feeling of mild contempt for Uncle George was beginning to give way to one which was much stronger. "Now, William," said Uncle George at breakfast, "I'm afraid it's going to rain today, so we'll do a little work together this morning, shall we?" "Nothing like work, is there? Your arithmetic's a bit shaky, isn't it? We'll rub that up. We love our work, don't we?" William eyed him coldly. "I don't think I'd better get muddling up my school work," he said. "I shouldn't like to be more on than the other boys next term. It wouldn't be fair to them." Uncle George rubbed his hands. "That feeling does you credit, my boy," he said. "But if we go over some of the old work, no harm can be done. History now. There's nothing like history, is there?" William agreed quite heartily that there wasn't. "We'll do some history then," said Uncle George briskly. "The lives of the great. Most inspiring. Better than those terrible things you used to waste your time on, eh?" The terrible things had included a trumpet, a beloved motor hooter, and an ingenious instrument very dear to William's soul that reproduced most realistically the sound of 2 cats fighting. These, at Uncle George's request, had been confiscated by William's father. Uncle George had not considered them educational. They also disturb his afternoon's rest. Uncle George settled himself and William down for a nice, quiet morning in the library. William, looking round for escape, found none. The outside world was wholly uninviting. The rain came down in torrents. Moreover, the 5 preceding weeks had broken William's spirits. He realized the impossibility of evading Uncle George. His own family were not sympathetic. They suffered from him considerably during the rest of the year, and were not sorry to see him absorbed completely by Uncle George's conscientious zeal. So Uncle George seated himself slowly and ponderously in an arm-chair by the fire. "When I was a boy, William," he began, leaning back and joining the tips of his fingers together, "I loved my studies." "I'm sure you love your studies, don't you? Which do you love most?" "Me," said William. "I like shooting and playing Red Indians." "Yes, yes," said Uncle George impatiently, "but those aren't studies, William. You must aim at being gentle." "It's not much good being gentle when you're playing Red Indians," said William stoutly. "A gentle Red Indian wouldn't get much done." But why play Red Indians?" said Uncle George. "A nasty rough game. No, we'll talk about history. You must mold your character upon that of the great heroes, William. You must be a Clive, a Napoleon, a Wolfe." "I've often been a wolf," said William. "That game's nearly as good as Red Indians. And bears is a good game, too. We might have bears here," he went on brightening. "Just you and me. Would you sooner be bear or hunter?" "I'd sooner be hunter," he hinted gently. "You misunderstand," said Uncle George. "I mean Wolfe the man, Wolfe the hero." William, who had little patience with heroes who came within the school curriculum, relapsed into gloom. "What lessons do we learn from such names, my boy?" went on Uncle George. William was on the floor behind Uncle George's chair, endeavoring to turn a somersault in a very restricted space. "History lessons and dates and things," he said shortly. "And the things they expect you to remember," he added with disgust. "No, no," said Uncle George, but the fire was hot and his chair was comfortable and his educational zeal was dying away. "To endure the buffets of fate with calmness, to smile at misfortune, to endure whatever comes, and so on." He stopped suddenly. William had managed the somersault, but it had somehow brought his feet into collision with Uncle George's neck. Uncle George sleepily shifted his position. "Boisterous, boisterous," he murmured disapprovingly. "You should combine the gentleness of a Moor with the courage of a Wellington, William." William now perceived that Uncle George's eyelids were drooping slowly, and William's sudden statuesque calm would have surprised many of his instructors. The silence and the warmth of the room had their effect. In less than 3 minutes, Uncle George was dead to the world around him. William's form relaxed. Then he crept up to look closely at the face of his enemy. He decided that he disliked it intensely. Something must be done at once. He looked round the room. There were not many weapons handy. Only his mother's work box stood on a chair by the window, and on it a pile of socks belonging to Robert, William's elder brother. Beneath either arm of his chair, one of Uncle George's coat tails protruded. William soon departed on his way rejoicing, while on to one of Uncle George's coat tails was firmly stitched a bright blue sock, and on to the other a brilliant orange one. Robert's taste in socks was decidedly loud. William felt almost happy. The rain had stopped, and he spent the morning with some of his friends whom he met in the road. They went bear hunting in the wood, and though no bears were found, still their disappointment was considerably allayed by the fact that one of them saw a mouse and another one distinctly smelt a rabbit. William returned to lunch whistling to himself and had the intense satisfaction of seeing Uncle George enter the dining room, obviously roused from his slumbers by the luncheon bell, and obviously quite unaware of the blue and orange socks that still adorned his person. "Curious," he ejaculated, as Ethel, William's grown-up sister, pointed out the blue sock to him. "Most curious." William departed discreetly, muttering something about "better tidy up a bit," which drew from his sister expressions of surprise and questions as to his state of health. "Most curious," again said Uncle George, who had now discovered the orange sock. When William returned, all excitement was over, and Uncle George was consuming roast beef with energy. "Ah, William," he said, "we must complete the history lesson soon. Nothing like history. Nothing like history. Nothing like history. Teaches us to endure the buffets of fate with calm and to smile at misfortune. Then we must do some geography." William groaned. "Most fascinating study. Rivers, mountains, cities, etc. Most improving. The morning should be devoted to intellectual work at your age, William, and the afternoon to the quiet pursuit of some improving hobby. You would then find the true joy of life." To judge from William's countenance, he did not wholly agree, but he made no objection. He had learnt that objection was useless, and against Uncle George's eloquent silence was his only weapon. After lunch, Uncle George followed his usual custom and retired to rest. William went to the shed in the back garden and continued the erection of a rabbit house that he had begun a few days before. He hoped that if he made a little house, Providence would supply a rabbit. He whistled blithely as he knocked nails in at random. "William, you mustn't do that now." He turned a stern gaze upon his mother. "Why not?" he said. "Uncle George is resting." With a crushing glance at her, he strolled away from the shed. Someone had left the lawn mower in the middle of the lawn. With one of his rare impulses of pure virtue, he determined to be useful. Also, he rather liked mowing the grass. "William, don't do that now," called his sister from the window. "Uncle George is resting." He deliberately drove the mowing machine into the middle of a garden bed and left it there. He was beginning to feel desperate. Then, "What can I do?" he said bitterly to Ethel, who was still at the window. "You'd better find some quiet, improving hobby," she said unkindly as she went away. It is a proof of the utterly broken state of William's spirit that he did actually begin to think of hobbies, but none of those that occurred to him interested him. Stamp collecting, pressed flowers, crest collecting. Ugh. He set off down the road, his hands in his pockets and his brows drawn into a stern frown. He amused himself by imagining Uncle George in various predicaments, lost on a desert island, captured by pirates, or carried off by an eagle. Then something in the window of a house he passed caught his eye, and he stopped suddenly. It was a stuffed bird under a glass case. Now that was something like a hobby, stuffing dead animals. He wouldn't mind having that for a hobby. And it was quite quiet. He could do it while Uncle George was resting. And it must be quite easy. The first thing to do, of course, was to find a dead animal. Any old thing would do to begin on. A dead cat or dog. He would do bigger ones like bears and lions later on. He spent nearly an hour in a fruitless search for a dead cat or dog. He searched the ditches on both sides of the road and several gardens. He began to have a distinct sense of grievance against the race of cats and dogs in general for not dying in his vicinity. At the end of the hour, he found a small dead frog. It was very dry and wrinkled, but it was certainly a dead frog and would do to begin on. He took it home in his pocket. He wondered what they did first in stuffing dead animals. He'd heard something about tanning them, but what was tanning, and how did one get it? Then he remembered suddenly having heard Ethel talk about the tanning in tea. So that was all right. The first thing to do was to get some tea. He went to the drawing room. It was empty, but upon the table near the fire was a tea tray and 2 cups. Evidently his mother and sister had just had tea there. He put the frog at the bottom of a cup and carefully filled the cup with tea from the teapot. Then he left it to soak and went out into the garden. A few minutes later, William's mother entered the drawing room. Uncle George had finished resting and was standing by the mantel piece with a cup in his hand. "I see you poured out my tea for me," he said, "but rather a curious taste. Doubtless you boil the milk now. Safer, of course. Much safer. But it imparts a curious flavor." He took another sip. "But I didn't pour out your tea," began Mrs. Brown. Here William entered. He looked quickly at the table. "Who's meddling with my frog?" he said angrily. "It's my hobby, and I'm stuffing frogs, and someone's been and took my frog. I left it on the table." "On the table?" said his mother.
"Yes."
"In a cup of tea. Getting tanning. You know, for stuffing. I was putting him in tanning first. Uncle George grew pale. In frozen silence, he put a spoon into his cup and investigated the contents. In still more frozen silence, Mrs. Brown and William watched. That moment held all the cumulative horror of a Greek tragedy. Then Uncle George put down his cup and went silently from the room. On his face was the expression of one who was going to look up the first train home. Fate had sent him a buffet he could not endure calmly, a misfortune at which he could not smile, and fate had avenged William for much. William was aware of a vague feeling of apprehension when he heard that Joan Clive, the little girl who lived next door, was having a strange cousin to stay for 3 weeks. All his life, William had accepted Joan's adoration and homage with condescending indifference, but he did not like to imagine a possible rival. "What's he coming for?" he demanded with an ungracious scowl, perched uncomfortably and dangerously on the high wall that separated the two gardens and glaring down at Joan. "What's he coming for, anyway?" "'Cause Mother's invited him," explained Joan simply, with a shake of her golden curls. "He's called Cuthbert. She says he's a sweet little boy." "Sweet," echoed William in a tone of exaggerated horror. "Ugh." "Well," said Joan, with the smallest note of indignation in her voice, "you needn't play with him if you don't like." "Me? Play? With him?" scowled William as if he could not believe his ears. "I'm not likely to go playing with a kid like what he'll be." Joan raised aggrieved blue eyes. "You're a horrid boy sometimes, William," she said. "Anyway, I shall have him to play with soon." It was the first time he had received anything but admiration from her. He scowled speechlessly. Cuthbert arrived the next morning. William was restless and ill, at ease, and several times climbed the ladder for a glimpse of the guest, but all he could see was the garden inhabited only by a cat and a gardener. He amused himself by throwing stones at the cat till he hit the gardener by mistake, and then fled precipitately before a storm of abuse. William and the gardener were enemies of very long standing. After dinner, he went out again into the garden and stood gazing through a crack in the wall. Cuthbert was in the garden. Though as old and as tall as William, he was dressed in an embroidered tunic, very short knickers, and white socks. Over his blue eyes his curls were brushed up into a golden halo. He was a picturesque child. "What shall we do?" Joan was saying. "Would you like to play hide and seek?" "No, let's not play at rough games," said Cuthbert. "What shall we do then?" said Joan, somewhat wearily. "Let's sit down and I'll tell you fairy stories," said Cuthbert. A loud snort from inside the wall just by his ear startled him, and he clutched Joan's arm. "What's that?" he said. There were sounds of clambering feet on the other side of the wall. Then William's grimy face appeared. "Hello, Joan," he said, ignoring the stranger. Joan's eyes brightened. "Come and play with us, William," she begged. "We don't want dirty little boys," murmured Cuthbert fastidiously. William could not, with justice, have objected to the epithet. He had spent the last half hour climbing onto the rafters of the disused coach, house, and dust and cobwebs adorned his face and hair. "He's always like that," explained Joan carelessly. By this time William had thought of a suitable response. "All right," he jeered. "Don't look at me then. Go on telling fairy stories." Cuthbert flushed angrily. "You're a nasty, rude little boy," he said. "I'll tell my mother." Thus war was declared. He came to tea the next day. Not all William's pleading could persuade his mother to cancel the invitation. "Well," said William darkly, "wait till you've seen him, that's all. Wait till you've heard him speaking. He cannot talk even. He cannot play. He tells fairy stories. He don't like dirt. He's got long hair and a funny long coat. He's awful, I tell you. I don't want to have him to tea. I don't want to be washed, and all just because he's coming to tea." But as usual, William's eloquence availed nothing. Several people came to tea that afternoon, and there was a sudden silence when Mrs. Clive, Joan, and Cuthbert entered. Cuthbert was in a white silk tunic embroidered with blue. He wore white shoes and white silk socks. His golden curls shone. He looked angelic. "Oh, the darling. Isn't he adorable? What a picture. Come here, sweetheart." Cuthbert was quite used to this sort of thing. His manners were perfect. He raised his face with a charming smile to be kissed, then sat down on the sofa between Joan and Mrs. Clive, swinging long bare legs. William, sitting, an unwilling victim, on a small chair in a corner of the room, brushed and washed till he shone again, was conscious of a feeling of fury quite apart from the usual sense of outrage that he always felt upon such an occasion. It was bad enough to be washed till the soap went into his eyes and down his ears despite all his protests. It was bad enough to have had his hair brushed till his head smarted. It was bad enough to be hustled out of his comfortable jersey into his Eton suit which he loathed. But to see Joan, his Joan, sitting next the strange, dressed-up boy, smiling and talking to him, that was almost more than he could bear with calmness. Previously, as has been said, he had received Joan's adoration with coldness, but previously there had been no rival. "William," said his mother, "take Joan and Cuthbert and show them your engine and books and things. Remember you're the host, dear," she murmured as he passed. "Try to make them happy." He turned upon her a glance that would have made a stronger woman quail. Silently, he led them up to his playroom. "There's my engine and my books. You can play with them," he said coldly to Cuthbert. "Let's go and play in the garden, you and me, Joan." But Joan shook her head. "I don't suppose she'd care to go out without me," said Cuthbert airily. "I'll go with you. This boy can play here if he likes." And William, artist in cursing as he was, could think of no response. He followed them into the garden, and there came upon him a wild determination to show his superiority. "You cannot climb that tree," he began. "I can," said Cuthbert sweetly. "Well, climb it then," grimly. "No, I don't want to get my things all messed." "I can climb it, but you cannot." "He cannot climb it, Joan. He's trying to pretend. He can climb it when he cannot. He knows I can climb it, but I don't want to get my things messed." Joan smiled admiringly at Cuthbert. "I'll show you," said William desperately. "I'll just show you." He showed them. He climbed to the tree, top swayed with his weight, then descended, hot and triumphant. The tree was covered with green lichen, a great part of which had deposited itself upon William's suit. His efforts also had twisted his collar round till its stud was beneath his ear. His heated face beamed with pride. For a moment Cuthbert was speechless. Then he said scornfully, "Don't he look a fright, Joan?" Joan giggled. But William was wholly engrossed in his self-imposed task of showing them. He led them to the bottom of the garden, where a small stream, now almost dry, disappeared into a narrow tunnel to flow under the road and reappear in the field at the other side. "You cannot crawl through that," challenged William. "You cannot do it. I've done it often. I bet you cannot. I bet you cannot get halfway." "Well, do it then," jeered Cuthbert. William, on all fours, disappeared into the mud and slime of the small round aperture. Joan clasped her hands, and even Cuthbert was secretly impressed. They stood in silence. At intervals, William's muffled voice came from the tunnel. "It's jolly muddy, too, I can tell you. I've caught a frog. I say, I've caught a frog. Crumbs. It's got away. If I tried, I could nearly drown here." At last, through the hedge, they saw him emerge in the field across the road. He swaggered across to them, glowing with his own heroism. As he entered the gate, he was rewarded by the old light of adoration in Joan's blue eyes, but on full sight of him it quickly turned to consternation. His appearance was beyond description. There was a malicious smile on Cuthbert's face. "Do something else," he urged him. "Go on, do something else." "Oh, William," said Joan anxiously, "you'd better not." But the gods had sent madness to William. He was drunk with the sense of his own prowess. He was regardless of consequences. He pointed to a little window high up in the coal house. "I can climb up that and slide down the coal inside. That's what I can do. There's nothing I cannot do. "All right," urged Cuthbert. "If you can do that, do it, and I'll believe you can do anything." For Cuthbert, with unholy glee, foresaw William's undoing. "Oh, William," pleaded Joan, "I know you're brave, but don't." But William was already doing it. They saw his disappearance into the little window. They heard plainly his descent down the coal heap inside, and in less than a minute he appeared in the doorway. He was almost unrecognizable. Coal. Dust adhered freely to the moist consistency of the mud and lichen already clinging to his suit, as well as to his hair and face. His collar had been almost torn away from its stud. William himself was smiling proudly, utterly unconscious of his appearance. Joan was plainly wavering between horror and admiration. Then the moment for which Cuthbert had longed arrived. "Children, come in now." Cuthbert, clean and dainty, entered the drawing room first and pointed an accusing finger at the strange figure which followed. "He's been climbing trees and crawling in the mud and rolling down the coals. He's a nasty rough boy." A wild babble arose as William entered. "William, you dreadful boy. Joan, come right away from him. Come over here. What will your father say? William, my carpet." For the greater part of the stream's bed still clung to William's boots. Doggedly, William defended himself. I was showing them how to do things. I was being a host. I was trying to make them happy. William, don't stand there talking. Go straight upstairs to the bathroom. It was the end of the first battle, and undoubtedly William had lost. Yet William had caught sight of the smile on Cuthbert's face, and William had decided that that smile was something to be avenged. But fate did not favor him. Indeed, fate seemed to do the reverse. The idea of a children's play did not emanate from William's mother or Joan's. They were both free from guilt in that respect. It emanated from Mrs. de Vere Carter. Mrs. de Vere Carter was a neighbor with a genius for organization. There were few things she did not organize till their every other aspect or aim was lost but that of organization. She also had what amounted practically to a disease for getting up things. She got up plays and bazaars and pageants and concerts. There were, in fact, few things she did not get up. It was the sight of Joan and Cuthbert walking together down the road, the sun shining on their golden curls, that had inspired her with the idea of getting up a children's play. And Joan must be the princess and little Cuthbert the prince. Mrs. de Vere Carter was to write the play herself. At first she decided on Cinderella. Unfortunately, there was a dearth of little girls in the neighborhood, and therefore it was decided at a meeting composed of Mrs. de Vere Carter, Mrs. Clive, Mrs. Brown, William's mother, and Ethel, William's sister, that William could easily be dressed up to represent one of the ugly sisters. It was, however, decided at a later meeting, consisting of William and his mother and sister, that William could not take the part. It was William who came to this decision. He was adamant against both threats and pleas. Without cherishing any delusions about his personal appearance, he firmly declined to play the part of the ugly sister. They took the news with deep apologies to Mrs. de Vere Carter, who was already in the middle of the first act. Her already low opinion of William sank to zero. Their next choice was Little Red Riding Hood, and William was lured, by glowing pictures of a realistic costume, into consenting to take the part of the wolf. Every day, he had to be dragged by some elder and responsible member of his family to a rehearsal. His hatred of Cuthbert was only equaled by his hatred of Mrs. de Vere Carter. "He acts so unnaturally," moaned Mrs. de Vere Carter. "Try really to think you're a wolf, darling. Put some spirit into it. Be animated." William scowled at her, and once more muttered monotonously his opening lines. "A wolf am I, a wolf on mischief bent. To eat this little maid is my intent. Take a breath after bent, darling. Now say it again." William complied, introducing this time a loud and audible gasp to represent the breath.
Mrs. de Vere cut aside.
"Now, Cuthbert, darling, draw your little sword and put your arm round Joan. That's right." Cuthbert obeyed, and his clear voice rose in a high chanting voice.
"Go.
You wicked wolf, away. This gentle maid shall never be your prey." "That's beautiful, darling. Now, William, slink away. Slink away, darling. Don't stand staring at Cuthbert like that. Slink away."
"I'll show you."
"Watch me slink away." Mrs. de Vere Carter slunk away realistically, and the sight of it brought momentary delight to William's weary soul. Otherwise, the rehearsals were not far removed from torture to him. The thought of being a wolf had at first attracted him, but actually a wolf character who had to repeat Mrs. de Vere Carter's meaningless poetry and be beaten at every turn by the smiling Cuthbert, who was forced to watch from behind the scenes the fond embraces of Cuthbert and Joan, galled his proud spirit unspeakably. Moreover, Cuthbert monopolized her both before and after the rehearsals. "Come away, Joan. He's probably all over coal dust and all of a mess." The continued presence of unsympathetic elders prevented his proper avenging of such insults. The day of the performance approached, and there arose some little trouble about William's costume. If the wearing of the dining room hearth rug had been forbidden by authority, it would have at once become the dearest wish of William's heart and a thing to be accomplished at all costs. But because authority decreed that that should be William's official costume as the wolf, William at once began to find enormous difficulties. "It's a dirty old thing. All dust and bits of black hair come off it on me. I don't think it looks like a wolf. Well, if I've got to be a wolf, folks might just as well know what I am. This looks like as if it came off a black sheep or something. You don't want folks to think I'm a sheep instead of a wolf, do you? You don't want me to be made look ridiculous before all these folks, do you?" He was slightly pleased by their promise to hire a wolf's head for him. He practiced wolf's howlings, though these had no part in Mrs. de Vere Carter's play, at night in his room till he drove his family almost beyond the bounds of sanity. Mrs. de Vere Carter had hired the village hall for the performance, and the proceeds were to go to a local charity. On the night of the play, the hall was packed, and Mrs. de Vere Carter was in a flutter of excitement and importance. "Yes, the dear children are splendid, and they look beautiful. We've all worked so hard. Yes, entirely my own composition. I only hope that William Brown won't murder my poetry as he does at rehearsals." The curtain went up. The scene was a wood, as was evident from a few small branches of trees placed here and there at intervals on the stage. Joan, in a white dress and red cloak, entered and began to speak, quickly and breathlessly, stressing every word with impartial regularity. "A little maid am I, Red Riding Hood. My journey lies along this dark, thick wood. Within my basket is a little jar of jam, a present for my grandmamma." Then Cuthbert entered, a prince in white satin with a blue sash. There was a rapt murmur of admiration in the audience as he made his appearance. William waited impatiently and uneasily behind the scenes. His wolf's head was very hot. One of the eye holes was beyond his range of vision. Through the other he had a somewhat prescribed view of what went on around him. He had been pinned tightly into the dining room hearth rug, his arms held down by his side. He was distinctly uncomfortable. At last his cue came. Red Riding Hood and the prince parted after a short conversation in which their acquaintance made rapid strides, and at the end of which the prince said casually as he turned to go, "So sweet a maid have I never seen. Before long I hope to make her my wife and queen." Red Riding Hood gazed after him, remarking, all in the same breath and tone, "How kind he is, how gentle, and how good! But see what evil beast comes through the wood." Here William entered amid wild applause. On the stage, he found that his one eye hole gave him an excellent view of the audience. His mother and father were in the second row. Turning his head round slowly, he discovered his sister Ethel sitting with a friend near the back. "William," hissed the prompter, "go on. A wolf am I." But William was engrossed in the audience. There was Mrs. Clive about the middle of the room. "A wolf am I. Go on, William." William had now found the cook and housemaid in the last row of all, and was turning his eye whole round in search of fresh discoveries. The prompter grew desperate. "A wolf am I, a wolf on mischief bent. Say it, William." William turned his wolf's head towards the wings. "Well, I was going to say it," he said irritably, "if you'd left me alone." The audience laughed. "Well, say it," said the voice of the invisible prompter. "Well, I'm going to," said William. "I'm not going to say that again what you said, 'cause they all heard it. I'll go on from there." The audience rocked in wild delight. Behind the scenes, Mrs. de Vere Carter wrung her hands and sniffed strong-smelling salts. "That boy," she moaned. Then William, sinking his voice from the indignant clearness with which it had addressed the prompter to a muffled murmur, continued, "To eat this little maid is my intent." But there leapt on the stage again the radiant white and blue figure of the prince brandishing his wooden sword. "Go, you wicked wolf, away. This gentle maid shall never be your prey." At this point William should have slunk away. But the vision revealed by his one available eye, whole of the prince standing in a threatening attitude with one arm round Joan, filled him with a sudden and unaccountable annoyance. He advanced slowly and threateningly towards the prince, and the prince, who had never before acted with William in his head, which was hired for one evening only, fled from the stage with a wild yell of fear. The curtain was lowered hastily. There was consternation behind the scenes. William, glaring from out his eye, whole and refusing to remove his head, defended himself in his best manner. "Well, I didn't tell him to run away, did I? I didn't mean him to run away. I only looked at him. Well, I was going to slink in a minute. I only wanted to look at him. I was going to slink." "Oh, never mind. Get on with the play," moaned Mrs. de Vere Carter. "But you've quite destroyed the atmosphere, William. You've spoilt the beautiful story. But hurry up, it's time for the grandmother's cottage scene now." Not a word of William's speeches was audible in the next scene, but his attack on and consumption of the aged grandmother was one of the most realistic parts of the play, especially considering the fact that his arms were imprisoned. "Not so roughly, William," said the prompter in a whisper. "Don't make so much noise. They cannot hear a word anyone's saying." At last William was clothed in the nightgown and nightcap and lying in the bed ready for Little Red Riding Hood's entrance. The combined effect of the rug and the head and the thought of Cuthbert had made him hotter and crosser than he ever remembered having felt before. He was conscious of a wild and unreasoning indignation against the world in general. Then Joan entered and began to pipe monotonously. "Dear Grandmamma, I've come with all quickness to comfort you and soothe your bed of sickness. Here's some little dainties I have brought to show you how we cherish you in our thought." Here William wearily rose from his bed and made an unconvincing spring in her direction. But onto the stage leapt Cuthbert once more, the vision in blue and white with golden curls shining and sword again drawn. Ha! Evil beast. It was too much for William. The heat and discomfort of his attire, the sight of the hated Cuthbert already about to embrace his Joan, goaded him to temporary madness. With a furious gesture, he burst the pins which attached the dining room hearth, rubbed to his person, and freed his arms. He tore off the white nightgown. He sprang at the petrified Cuthbert, a small wild figure in a jersey suit and a wolf's head. Mrs. de Vere Carter had filled Red Riding Hood's basket with packages of simple groceries, which included, among other things, a paper bag of flour and a jar of jam. William seized these wildly and hurled handfuls of flour at the prostrate, screaming Cuthbert. The stage was suddenly in an uproar. The other small actors promptly joined the battle. The prompter was too panic-stricken to lower the curtain. The air was white with clouds of flour. The victim scrambled to his feet and fled, a ghost-like figure, round the table. "Take him off me," he yelled. "Take him off me. Take William off me." His wailing was deafening. The next second he was on the floor, with William on top of him. William now varied the proceedings by emptying the jar of jam onto Cuthbert's face and hair. They were separated at last by the prompter and stage manager, while the audience rose and cheered hysterically. But louder than the cheering rose the sound of Cuthbert's lamentation. "He's a nasty, rough boy. He pushed me down. He's messed my nice clothes." Mrs. de Vere Carter was speechless. "That boy, that boy, that boy," was all she could say. William was hurried away by his family before she could regain speech. "You've disgraced us publicly," said Mrs. Brown plaintively. "I thought you must have gone mad. People will never forget it. I might have known." When pressed for an explanation, William would only say, "Well, I felt hot. I felt awful hot, and I didn't like Cuthbert." He appeared to think this sufficient explanation, though he was fully prepared for the want of sympathy displayed by his family. "Well," he said firmly, "I'd just like to see you do it. I'd just like to see you be in the head and that old rug and have to say stupid things and see folks you don't like, and I bet you do something." But he felt that public feeling was against him and relapsed sadly into silence. From the darkness in front of them came the sound of Cuthbert's wailing as Mrs. Clive led her 2 charges home. "Poor little Cuthbert," said Mrs. Brown. "If I were Joan, I don't think I'd ever speak to you again." "Huh," ejaculated William scornfully. But at William's gate a small figure slipped out from the darkness, and 2 little arms crept round William's neck. "Oh, William," she whispered, "he's going tomorrow, and I am glad. Isn't he a softy? Oh, William, I do love you. You do such exciting things."